Hello, Brobs. We're back with the Golem Remembered 1909 to 1980 Variations of a Jewish Legend by Arnold L. Goldsmith. Move on to chapter 5, which is a rather long one. Gustav, Meyrink, and the Psychological Gothic. This is a rather long chapter, so it'll probably be broken up into 4 parts. That's my proposed plan here. Let's go. In Gustav Meyrink's novel, The Golem, which I do believe I have, an old puppeteer asks a Jewish sage named Shemaja Hillel about the Kabbalah and the Zohar. Zwak, the puppet master, complains that this famous book of the occult can be seen only in a London museum, and that it is written in Chaldean, Aramaic, and Hebrew. He wishes that there was some book containing all the keys to the riddles of the other world instead of just some of them. Pardon. Hillel replies that all of life is made of questions and more questions. Do you suppose that it is only caprice that our Jewish sacred writings are written down in consonants? Every man must find the hidden vowels which determine the meaning destined for him alone. Otherwise, the living world would petrify into dogma. Like Zwak, Gustav Meyrink, 1868 to 1932, was fascinated by the occult and during his adult life constantly searched for clues to the existence of a life beyond the quotidian. When Zwak says, "I cannot help it, the supernatural is the most fascinating subject in the world," he is speaking for the author. It was only natural that Meyrink's obsession would eventually lead him to the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. Moreover, as a resident of Prague, intimately acquainted with the Jewish ghetto, he could not miss hearing stories about the Golem. This legend gave him the title and a motif for, but not the real subject of, his first novel. Meyrink's dual nature. Gustav Meyrink, born Gustav Meyer, was not a Jew. He was born in Vienna on January 19th, 1868, the illegitimate son of an actress, Maria Meyer, and an elderly nobleman, Karl Freier Warnbühler von and zu Hemmingen, with a father who rejected him and a mother interested only in her career. The bastard offspring of this relationship had an unhappy childhood. After moving to Prague in 1884, Meyer eventually went to a business college and then worked in the export trade before he and a partner opened their own bank. Yet, according to E.F. Blailer, there were at least 2 other Meyers in habitation within his body. The first of there was the aggressive playboy and bohemian, who delighted in using his sharp, sarcastic tongue to annoy the stodgy German patricians of Prague and wasted no chance to shock them. He was athletic and won many prizes as a sculler, including championship of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a skilled fencer, a riotous liver who rode about in balloon-decorated carriages with troops of chorus girls, and he affronted the horses by driving the first automobile in Prague. The other part of Meyrink's personality was the occultist, dreamer, mystic, and magician. This side of Meyrink could be seen in his bizarre surroundings, such as the tower in which he lived in an old part of the city. His strangely decorated room, according to Blailer, contained the confessional booth, a terrarium filled with exotic African mice, a large picture of Madame Blavatsky, and a sculpture of a ghost disappearing into a wall. The pivotal incident in the development of this side of his life is like a scene out of one of his own fantasies. About to commit suicide in his early 20s, Meyer was interrupted when a pamphlet advertising a series of occult books was shoved under his door. The young man took this interruption as a sign of the direction in which he should turn and devoted the remainder of his life to a spiritual quest and praxis that eventually worked through spiritualism, Theosophy, alchemy, Christian mysticism, Kabbalism, various yogas, Tantrism, Sufism, Far Eastern thought, and primitive religions. Intent on exposing fakery, the skeptical Meyer joined various occult groups and, accompanied by magicians, attended numerous seances. Frequently disillusioned, he came to regard occultism as the religion of the stupid, but he gradually worked out an independent, eclectic position of his own that dominated his later life and is beyond the scope of this study. In January 1902, Myers suffered a traumatic experience that was to supply him with an important plot development in the Golem. He was arrested for bank fraud and jailed for several months during the long investigation that followed. Though he was charged with embezzlement and misuse of customers' funds, Blyler thinks that in all probability he was innocent and guilty of carelessness only. If even that, it is possible that he was the scapegoat for the practices of his partner. Possibly he was the victim of some of the many enemies he had made, especially because of his notoriety in the newspapers, cafe gossip, and official affairs. His first marriage to Hedwig Aloysia Sertle had broken up, and he could not marry Philomena Burnt, his mistress, until the divorce was granted 7 years later. His second wife was slandered by a doctor in the Army Reserve, and Meyer was frustrated and humiliated. When his challenge to duel the offender was at first denied because of Meyer's illegitimate birth. Myers 3 months, wait, you couldn't have a duel if you were illegitimate? What kind of shit is that? Myers' 3 months in prison may have saved the doctor, but upon his release in April 1902, even though completely cleared, Gustav Meyer was a ruined man. Adding to his problems was the intense pain from an illness which his doctors diagnosed as tuberculosis of the spine. As a result, he spent some time in a sanitarium. Though he recovered, for the rest of his life he suffered relapses and knew considerable pain. Even before his arrest, Gustav Meyer had dabbled in writing, but while he was in the sanitarium, he met Oscar Schmitz, an author who, recognizing his literary interest and penchant for satire, urged him to write. The immediate result of this advice was Meyer's submission of a satirical fantasy set in Indochina to one of Germany's finest magazines, Simplicissimus. This story, Der Heiß Soldat, was published in the fall of 1901 under the pen name Gustav Meyrink, which he adopted legally in 1917. For the next 10 years, Meyrink struggled to make a living from his writing. William R. Van Buskirk sees the satirical thrust of Meyrink's work as generally directed against the military, financiers, speceratum, Philistines, and science in its dogmatic sense. Van Buskirk concludes that the basis of Meyrink's satires can be found in his life in Prague and in his reactions as a mystic to a materialistic society. Moreover, his personality, though paradoxical, expressed a moral concern for humanity by attacking what he felt to be the false values of this world in order to make room for the growth of a more real inner world. In this, he was related to the expressionistic movement. According to Blyler, in bitterness, savagery, and verbal brilliance, Meyrink's work is very similar to that of Ambrose Bierce. If Meyrink was not as prolific or as amusing as Bierce, he was more bizarre and more profound. In the first decade of the 20th century, Meyrink's books were collections of his stories published earlier in magazines like Simplicissimus or Hermann Hesse's Mars. For a short while, he himself edited Der Lieb Augustin with such famous contributors as Max Brod, Paul Busan, Stefan Zweig, and Frank Wedekind. But the journal fell because of financial problems. Toward the end of the same period, he began to translate the works of Charles Dickens into German, finishing 7 volumes by 1914. He also tried his hand at drama in 1910, collaborating with the Central European writer Alexander Rosenfield, with whom he finished 4 plays. Wasn't one Rhoda sufficient? Blyler points out that as part of Meyrink's interest in occult studies, he also tried to establish a puppet theater for playing serious symbolic works as well as crowd pleasers. This concept, which was never brought to actuality, finds echoes in Der Golem. Van Buskirk quotes Rhoda on how Meyrink began work on the Golem. It had been in Meyrink's mind in Prague. He certainly knew of the Golem legends. while still there, and it is almost safe to assume that he had made notes and preliminary sketches of his work while still in the city. That is, prior to 1904. Blyler thinks he started it 2 years later because it did not appear as a subject in his correspondence with his friend Alfred Kubin, the artist, until January 1907. Meyrink originally planned to write a short sketch on the legend, but the Golem theme was too big. He decided to collaborate with Kubin, who was to do the illustrations as Meyrink finished new chapters for Mars. This plan failed, according to Kubin, when Meyrink ran dry and was unable to continue. A practical man, Kubin then used the illustrations for his own novel, Die an der Siete, whenever it says Seat, in 1908. Whether Meyrink knew Kubin's novel in 1909 is unclear, but there are some interesting similarities between his work and Kubin's, such as the ghetto setting, the moral atmosphere, the fanciful image of the hermaphrodite at the end of both novels, and especially the figure of the alter ego, the split personality. As Meyrink continued work on his novel, various publishers tried to buy the rights, but he refused and talked of publishing the book first in England. Months and years passed as he put publishers off with promises that the novel would be finished in a matter of weeks. In 1911, a fragment of the work was published in Pan, and Meyrink signed a contract with the publisher Kurt Wolff. More years passed. The truth of the matter, says Blyler, was that Meyrink had become lost in his own story. He had too much material, too many ideas, too many characters, and he could not see his way clear to discarding elements and establishing a central line. Apparently, Meyrink resorted to all sorts of outside help, drawing up geometric patterns, diagramming characters and plot lines according to Van Buskirk, even working out the complicated plot on a chessboard with a friend, until finally discarding about half the material. Blyler thinks that these pangs of composition perhaps account for the occasional jerkiness and thinness that do not occur in Meyrink's other novels. When Der Golem was finally published in book form in 1915, it soon became a bestseller, almost 250,000 copies, but Meyrink, desperate for cash, sold his work outright to Wolff for $2,000 rather than wait for royalty checks. Over the years, the novel has been translated into Swedish, Dutch, Russian, Italian, Spanish, and other languages. Despite the success of this novel, allegedly his best, Meyrink's works have not continued to sell well. They have been more or less neglected by the literary world, except for a special issue of the French magazine La Herne, although Thomas Mann, Franz Kafka, and Hermann Hesse all praise them. Encounters with the Golem of Prague. A brief summary of Meyrink's complicated novel will make the analysis that follows easier to comprehend. The unnamed narrator, living in the ghetto of Prague about 1890, is through his dreams reliving the bizarre events in the life of Athanasius Pernath, a gem cutter whose hat he mistakenly took home one day after Mass. Pernath, a bachelor between 40 and 45, has recovered from a nervous breakdown, his past completely obliterated by hypnosis. He has been able to return to society, but is currently undergoing a strange identity crisis. Struggling to suppress his libidinal desires, he had a mystical yearning for an ideal state transcending the actual. 3 women are involved in his quest. Rosina the whore and Miriam the mystical Jewish represent the 2 extremes. The Countess Angelina, whom he once loved when they were children, but who is now an adulteress threatened by blackmail, stands somewhere between the other 2 and represents a third alternative. Pernath's decision to help Angelina escape from the blackmail attempt of a greedy junk dealer, Aaron Wastertrum, leads him to join forces with the junk dealer's vengeful son, a consumptive medical student named Karosek. Pernath's adventures led him to a frightening trip underground through secret passageways and trapdoors, a night spent trapped in the Golem's room, and a lengthy imprisonment by the local authorities for a murder he never committed. Reading that paragraph has murdered me. Finally, Pernath, through the guidance of Miriam's father, Shemaha Hillel, and a fellow prisoner, the rapist murderer Amadeus Laponder, is able to survive the perils of his quest for the idea of selfhood and reach that state of eternal union with Miriam in a paradisical world which only select individuals are allowed to enter. Unlike the works discussed in chapters 2 to 4 of this study, Meyrink's novel does not give the Golem a central role, despite its title. In fact, the legendary figure actually appears in no more than 1/5 of the pages, and Rabbi Lowe's name is never even mentioned. The rabbi does, however, play an important role in two major scenes in Meyrink's last novel, Engel vom Westlichen Fenster. It is evident from one of the few existing drafts of Meyrink's Golem that he had difficulty deciding how to use the legendary creature. One possibility was to have him appear simply as a ghost. Another plan involved having Karosek disguise himself as the Golem in order to drive the villainous junk dealer to suicide. A third plan involved Karlashek Bum, a character who does not appear in the published novel. He was beaten by an angry mob while dressed in the Golem's clothes. And a variation of this last plan found its way into the plot. Only a variation of this last plan found its way into the plot. A clue to some of the novel's complexities is provided by Shemajaha Hillel, the register of the Jewish council house and also the keeper of the paraphernalia of the old synagogue. Including the clay image of the Golem, he tells the puppet master Zwak it is possible for a man to find himself in murky windings underground, from which he may not emerge save by virtue of a talisman that he bears within himself. To illustrate his point, Hillel then tells the Talmudic story of what happened to three men who descended into the realm of darkness. One went mad, one blind, and only Rabbi Akiba returned, explaining that he had met himself. It is this dangerous pilgrimage that the protagonist must undertake in his quest for his idea self. Like Spencer Bryden and Henry James' remarkable ghost story, The Jolly Corner, written only a dozen years before Meyrink's, Pernath must undergo an intensely psychological experience in which he confronts his frightening alter ego in order to discover his true identity. In both cases, a middle-aged man meets the trial successfully. The question which preoccupies Pernath is, who is this I? Meyrink extends this theme of uncertain identity by introducing the Golem as an unexpected visitor to the gem cutter's room. Pernath does not recognize his strange visitor, who never speaks a word but removes a rare, handsomely bound book from his pocket and leafs through the pages until he comes to the chapter entitled Iber, or the fecundation of the soul. The initial letter in red and gold has worn away and needs repairing. With only a gesture, the stranger indicates the necessary restoration and leaves. Through such symbolism, Meyrink implies that Pernath's own ego is in disrepair. His own soul needs refurbishing. Further hints of the nature of Pernath's problems are given as he reads the designated chapter after his visitor's departure and imagines that the words take on erotic shapes. Meyrink contradicts himself in chapter 13, where the narrator says that the book was written all in Hebrew and for that reason quite incomprehensible to me. First, they appear to be gaily dressed female slaves who dance for him. Then they all give way before a gigantic naked female who is dragged into the room, the pulse in her left wrist throbbing like an earthquake. She is finally replaced by a naked man and a woman embracing. They merge and become a hermaphrodite. This figure is soon followed by others risen from the dead who stare into his heart and terrify him with beseeching looks. The voice of the book reveals things that had been in him all along, but forgotten till this day of delivery. The scantily clad female slaves and the archetypal figure of the orgasmic woman all suggest Pernath's subconscious desires, but the figure of the hermaphrodite foreshadows his deliverance from this sensuality to a higher, more etherealized state. In other words, the fecundation of his soul. The fecundation, is that how you say it? It sounds too much like the F word, buddy. Meyrink's use of the mysterious Golem to represent Pernath's other self is suggested when the artist, after his guest's departure, tries in vain to remember his visitor's features. until suddenly my skin, my muscles, the whole of my body remembered without telling my brain. They made movements I had neither willed nor desired. It was as though my limbs belonged to me no more. To his amazement, he begins to imitate the stranger perfectly. Even Pernath's appearance changes. My unfamiliar face was now clean shaven, with prominent cheekbones. My eyes were slanting. As the other figure completely takes over Pernath's being, he is terrified. I knew now who the stranger was. And that at any moment I could feel his personality within me at my will, yet still I was unable to conjure up his actual presence before me, face to face. I knew I should never be able to. As he places the stranger's book into his iron box for safekeeping, it was as though my sense of touch must flow through a long, dark streak of nothingness before it merged into my conscious self. As though betwixt me and inanimate objects yawned a great gulf of time, as though they belonged to an age past and gone, of which I had once been part. The bridging of this gulf of time and the merging of the conscious and unconscious selves must all take place before Pernath's quest can be completed. Playing a crucial role in the transformation is the Golem, who allegedly returns to haunt the ghetto every 33 years. Meyrink's use of Christian symbolism here reinforces his theme of the resurrection and redemption, the transcendence of the idea over the real. According to the legends, Pernath is told the Golem is always identified with destruction and violence. When he reappears, someone is usually murdered. Meyrink implies that Pernath is beginning to identify with this dark force, the subconscious, the irrational, the id. Such doubling of character in novels and drama, according to Robert Rogers in The Double in Literature, 1970, increases reader identification with the protagonist because of the displacement of the hero's guilt unto his secret sharer. And that's going to conclude my reading for today, bravs. Goodbye. Goodbye.